If you've listened to other stories on this channel, the one about Apple, the one about the personal computer, the one about how the internet works, you may have noticed a particular company that kept appearing in the background of all of them. It was rarely the main character. It was usually a few steps off to the side, in the part of the story that most people don't pay attention to. But it was there, in almost every one of those histories, quietly becoming one of the most important companies in the world while everyone was looking at something else. That company is Microsoft. Tonight's story is about it, about where it came from, and how it grew, and how it ended up running in some form on most of the computers in the world for most of the last 40 years. It is a less glamorous story than the Apple story. There are no famous product launches with sledgehammers and standing ovations. There is no single charismatic founder whose face ended up on magazine covers and movie posters. There is, instead, a story about software, and about business, and about a particular kind of relentlessness that turned a tiny company in Albuquerque into one of the largest enterprises in human history. It is, in some ways, a quieter and stranger story than the more famous ones. It is, for the same reasons, a good one to fall asleep to. But before we get into any of it, take a moment. Let the day come to a stop. Whatever happened in it, it's finished now, and there's nothing left to do tonight except rest. The next several hours belong to sleep, and the only role this story has is to keep you company while you drift toward it. Let your body settle into the mattress. Let your shoulders come down from wherever the day left them. Let your hands rest. Let your jaw unclench. Let your breathing slow to whatever pace it wants to find on its own, without any help from you. You won't need to remember any of what follows. That's the whole point of these recordings. If you fall asleep a few minutes from now, the story will keep going without you, and the names and dates and details can wash past you like water. If you wake up in the middle of the night with no idea where the story has gotten to, that's fine. You haven't missed anything. There's nothing to catch up on. The story is just here, going on quietly in the dark, for as long as you want it. One thing before we start, and then I won't interrupt the story again. These recordings are long on purpose. They're meant to be the opposite of the short, fast, attention-grabbing things that fill up most of the day. If that's the kind of thing you find useful at night, something long and slow that asks nothing of you, then you might want to subscribe, so that the next one turns up when you need it. And if you have a moment, you could leave a note saying where you're listening from. It's a quiet pleasure, scrolling through those notes later and seeing how many people in how many different places are lying in the dark listening to the same slow voice. None of it is required. It's just there if you want it. That's the last I'll ask of you tonight. The story begins in the 1950s, in Seattle, with a boy named Bill, who was born into a comfortable family, and who turned out to have an unusual mind for a particular kind of logical thinking that, at the time, almost no one had any use for. Chapter 1. The boy and the machine William Henry Gates III was born in October of 1955. In Seattle, Washington. His father was a prominent lawyer. His mother was a school teacher who later became active in various charitable and civic organizations. The family was well off, well connected, and well established in the social life of the city. Bill was the middle child and the only son. He was, by the accounts of the people who knew him as a child, an intense and competitive boy, fond of games and puzzles and arguments, with a particular drive to win at whatever he turned his attention to. His parents, who had noticed that he was both extremely bright and somewhat difficult to manage in a conventional school, enrolled him when he was around 12 in a private school in Seattle called Lakeside. Lakeside was an expensive and academically rigorous school, and it had, in the late 1960s, something that almost no other school in the country had. It had a computer terminal. The terminal was connected over a telephone line to a large computer somewhere else in the city, which the students could use to write and run programs. The arrangement had been paid for by the school's Mothers Club, which had held a rummage sale to raise the money. None of them could have known what they were setting in motion. The way computers worked in those days is worth describing, because it was so different from how they work now. There was no personal computer sitting on a desk. The computer itself was an enormous, expensive machine, owned by a company that rented out access to it. The students at Lakeside connected to it through a teletype terminal, which was something like a typewriter connected to a telephone. They typed their programs on the teletype, which sent them over the phone line to the distant computer, which ran them and sent back the results, which the teletype printed onto a roll of paper. Every minute of connection to the computer cost money. The students were, in effect, sharing a small slice of an expensive machine that lived somewhere across the city, communicating with it through a noisy mechanical typewriter, paying by the minute for the privilege. It was, by modern standards, an extraordinarily cumbersome way to use a computer, but to the handful of students who fell in love with it, it was a doorway into something they had never imagined. The young Bill Gates became, almost immediately, obsessed with the computer. He spent every hour he could at the terminal. He learned to program in the languages that were available at the time. He was joined in his obsession by a small group of other Lakeside students, including a boy 2 years older than him named Paul Allen, who shared his fascination with computers and who would, a few years later, become his business partner. Gates and Allen, along with a few others, spent enormous amounts of time at the computer terminal during their teenage years, learning to program at a level that very few people of any age had reached at that point. The friendship between Gates and Allen was, from the beginning, a partnership of complementary temperaments. Allen was the dreamer, the one who read science fiction and imagined what computers might someday become, the one with the broad vision of where the technology was heading. Gates was the more focused and aggressive of the two, more interested in the immediate practical problem in front of him, more competitive, more driven to win. Allen would later describe their dynamic as one in which he would have the big idea, and Gates would figure out how to turn it into a business, and then pursue that business with a relentlessness that Allen found by turns inspiring and exhausting. The two of them spent their teenage years in a kind of shared obsession, talking endlessly about computers, staying up through the nights at the terminal, getting into the kind of trouble that obsessive teenagers get into when they have access to expensive equipment. There is a story from those years that captures something about how Gates operated, even as a teenager. A local company had a computer that it let the Lakeside students use, in exchange for the students finding the bugs in the company's software. The students, including Gates and Allen, spent months hunting for bugs, learning an enormous amount about how the computer worked in the process. When the arrangement ended, Gates and Allen were not finished learning. They found other ways to get access to computers. They took on small programming jobs for local businesses. By the time Gates was in his mid-teens, he and Allen had written, between them, programs to schedule classes at their school, to analyze traffic data for the local government, and to handle various other small tasks that businesses were willing to pay for. They were, by any measure, unusually accomplished programmers for their age. They were also, already, thinking about computers as a business rather than just a hobby. There is a particular detail about the class scheduling program that is often told, because it reveals something about the young Gates. He wrote the program that scheduled the classes at Lakeside, and he wrote it, by various accounts, in such a way that he ended up in classes full of the girls he wanted to be in classes with. Whether this is entirely true or has been embellished over the years is hard to say. But the story has lasted because it fits the picture of Gates that emerged later, a person who understood how systems worked, and who was entirely willing to use that understanding to arrange the world to his own advantage. He was not, even as a teenager, a naive idealist about technology. He was someone who saw very clearly that whoever controlled the software controlled the outcomes, and who intended to be the one who controlled the software. What made this period unusual was the timing. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, computers were enormous, expensive machines that lived in the basements of large companies and universities. The idea that an individual person might own a computer was, to most people, absurd. The idea that there might be a large business in writing software for individual people to use was even more absurd, since there were no individual people who owned computers. Gates and Allen were learning to program at exactly the moment before the personal computer existed. When the personal computer did arrive, a few years later, they would be among the very small number of people in the world who already knew how to write software for it, and who had already been thinking about software as a business. The timing, in retrospect, was almost impossibly fortunate. But the two of them had also done the work to be ready for it, in a way that almost no one else had. Gates went off to Harvard in 1973. He was, by his own later accounts, somewhat directionless there. He took mathematics and computer science classes. He played poker. He was not entirely sure what he wanted to do with his life. Paul Allen, meanwhile, had taken a job at a company in the Boston area, partly so that he could be near Gates. The two of them continued to talk, constantly about computers and about what might be coming. They both had a sense, which was not yet widely shared, that something was about to happen in computing that would change everything. They were waiting, without quite knowing it, for a particular machine to appear. Gates' time at Harvard was, in a way, a study in a brilliant young person who had not yet found the thing he was meant to do. He was, by all accounts, one of the strongest mathematics students of his year, capable of work at the highest level. But he was not passionate about pure mathematics in the way that the people who become great mathematicians are. He was restless. He played a great deal of poker, often through the night, and was, by various accounts, good at it, in a way that perhaps revealed something about his temperament, his comfort with risk, his ability to read situations, his willingness to bet aggressively when he thought the odds were in his favor. He was waiting for something, though he might not have been able to say what. The thing he was waiting for turned out to be the personal computer, and when it arrived, he abandoned Harvard without much hesitation. The decision to drop out of one of the most prestigious universities in the world, to pursue a business in a field that barely existed, would later be told as a story of bold vision. At the time, it was simply a young man following the thing that obsessed him, in the way that obsessive young people sometimes do, with a confidence that, in his case, turned out to be justified. His parents, by various accounts, were not entirely pleased. They had hoped he would finish his degree, perhaps follow his father into law or some other respectable profession. The idea of dropping out of Harvard to write software for hobbyist computers in New Mexico was not, in 1975, an obviously sensible plan. There was no established software industry. There was no clear path to wealth or success in writing programs for tiny machines that almost no one owned. Gates was, in effect, betting his future on the conviction that the personal computer was going to be enormous, and that software was going to be the most valuable part of it. A conviction that very few people shared at the time. And that turned out to be one of the most accurate predictions about the future that anyone made in that era. He did not, technically, drop out entirely at first. He took a leave of absence, leaving open the possibility of returning. He never did return. Decades later, Harvard would award him an honorary degree, and he would joke, in the speech he gave, about finally getting the credential he had failed to earn the first time. Chapter 2. The Letter and the Language the Machine appeared in January of 1975. It was called the Altair 8800, and it appeared, as we walked through on another night, on the cover of Popular Electronics magazine. The Altair was the first personal computer that an ordinary hobbyist could buy and own. It was, by modern standards, almost uselessly primitive. It had no screen, no keyboard, no permanent storage, and was programmed by flipping switches on the front panel. But it had, at its center, one of the new microprocessors that had recently become available, and it could, in principle, be programmed to do useful things. To the small community of people who had been waiting for personal computers, the Altair was a revelation. It is hard, now, to convey how strange and exciting the Altair was to the people who understood what it represented. Most people, looking at it, would have seen a box of switches and lights, with no obvious purpose. There was no screen to show anything. There was no way to type words or numbers into it except by flipping switches in particular patterns. When it did something, the result was shown only as a pattern of small lights on the front panel. To an ordinary person, it would have seemed like a useless toy, or perhaps not even recognizable as a computer at all. But to the small number of people who understood what was inside it, who understood that it contained a real microprocessor, a genuine computer at its heart, the same kind of computing power that had previously filled entire rooms, the Altair was the beginning of everything. It meant that, for the first time, an individual person could own a computer. Not rent time on a distant machine, not share a terminal at a school or a company, but actually own a computer, sitting on a desk in their own home. For people like Gates and Allen, who had spent years dreaming about exactly this, the appearance of the Altair was the moment they had been waiting for. Paul Allen saw the magazine first. He bought a copy at a newsstand in Harvard Square and brought it to Gates. The two of them understood immediately what they were looking at. They understood that the Altair and the machines that would inevitably follow it would need software, and they understood that they were perhaps uniquely positioned to provide it. They decided, more or less on the spot, that they would write a version of the programming language BASIC for the Altair. BASIC was a relatively simple, beginner-friendly programming language that had been developed at Dartmouth in the 1960s. If they could get BASIC running on the Altair, then ordinary people would be able to write programs for the machine, which would make it far more useful than it was in its switch-flipping state. There was a problem, which was that Gates and Allen did not own an Altair. They did not, in fact, have any access to the microprocessor that the Altair was built around. So they did something that in retrospect was remarkably audacious. They wrote a version of BASIC for the Altair without ever having touched an Altair. Allen wrote a program on the large computer at Harvard that Gates had access to that simulated the Altair's microprocessor. Gates wrote the BASIC interpreter to run on the simulated machine. They worked for several weeks in a state of intense focus, mostly through the nights, surviving on very little sleep. By the time they were finished, they had a version of BASIC that, as far as they could tell, would run on a real Altair, even though neither of them had ever seen one. Before they wrote it, though, they had done one other thing. They had written a letter, or rather, Gates had made a phone call, and then they had followed up to the company that made the Altair, a small outfit in Albuquerque, New Mexico, called MITS. They had told MITS that they had a version of BASIC nearly ready for the Altair. This was not, strictly speaking, true at the time they said it. They had not yet written it. But the claim got them a meeting. MITS told them that if they could demonstrate a working BASIC, MITS would be interested in licensing it. Allen flew to Albuquerque to do the demonstration in early 1975. He brought with him a paper tape containing the basic program that he and Gates had written on the simulated machine. He had never run it on a real Altair. He did not know, until the moment he loaded it into the machine at the MITS office, whether it would work at all. He loaded the tape. The machine churned through it. And then, after a tense pause, it worked. The Altair, running the BASIC that Gates and Allen had written without ever touching the machine, printed a response to the screen. It was, by the accounts of the people involved, one of the more remarkable feats of programming of the era. The two young men had written working software for a computer they had never used, and it had worked on the first real attempt. It is worth lingering on how unlikely this success was, because it captures something about the two young men and the moment they were in. They had written a fairly complex piece of software, a programming language interpreter for a machine they had never seen, by simulating that machine on a completely different computer, working from nothing more than the published specifications of the microprocessor at the Altair's center. There were 1,000 small things that could have gone wrong. A single error, anywhere in the thousands of instructions they had written could have caused the whole thing to fail. They had no way to test it on a real Altair before the demonstration. Alan had spent the flight to Albuquerque writing the last piece of code, the part that would load the program into the machine, because they had not gotten to it before he left. He was, in a sense, finishing the work on the airplane, on the way to the single demonstration that would determine whether they had a business or not. And then it worked on the first try in front of the people who could make or break them. It was the kind of moment that, in retrospect, looks like destiny, but that, at the time, was simply two young men taking an enormous risk and getting away with it. Mitz licensed the BASIC. Alan went to work for Mitz in Albuquerque. Gates, after a while, dropped out of Harvard and moved to Albuquerque as well. The two of them formed a partnership to develop and sell software. They called it Microsoft, with a hyphen, a name meant to evoke microcomputer software. The hyphen was dropped after a year or so. The company, Microsoft, was officially founded in 1975 in Albuquerque, in the shadow of the Mitz company whose machine had given them their start. Gates was 19. Alan was 22. The early Microsoft was a tiny operation. It had a handful of employees. It made its money licensing BASIC and then other programming languages to the various personal computer companies that were springing up in the mid and late 1970s. The business model from the very beginning was a particular one that would define Microsoft for the rest of its history. Microsoft did not make computers. It made the software that ran on other companies' computers. It licensed that software to the computer makers who installed it on their machines. This meant that Microsoft could, in principle, have its software running on every personal computer in the world, regardless of which company had made the computer. It was a business model with almost unlimited room to grow, and Gates, even at 19, seemed to understand its potential more clearly than almost anyone else in the industry. There is one episode from the very early days of Microsoft that is worth telling, because it revealed something about Gates's character that would matter enormously later. In the mid-1970s, the hobbyist community that had grown up around the early personal computers had a particular culture, which was that software was something you shared freely. The hobbyists at clubs like the Homebrew Computer Club, which we walked through on another night, would copy programs and pass them around to one another in the spirit of mutual help and shared exploration. When Microsoft's BASIC for the Altair started circulating, the hobbyists did what they always did. They copied it and shared it with one another for free, rather than paying Microsoft for it. Gates was furious. He wrote an open letter addressed to the hobbyist community, which was published in various computer club newsletters in early 1976. In the letter, he argued that copying software without paying for it was theft. He argued that if hobbyists expected good software to be written, they would have to be willing to pay for it, because no one could afford to spend the enormous effort of writing good software if it was simply going to be copied for free. The letter was, in the context of the sharing culture of the time, deeply controversial. Many hobbyists were offended by it. The idea that software was a product to be bought and sold like any other product, rather than knowledge to be shared freely, was a new and, to many people, an unwelcome idea. But Gates was, in a sense, simply ahead of his time. The view he expressed in that letter, that software was valuable property, that the people who wrote it deserved to be paid for it, that there was an enormous business to be built in selling software as a product, was the view that would, over the following decades, come to dominate the entire industry. The free-sharing culture of the hobbyists did not survive the commercialization of the personal computer. Software became a product, exactly as Gates had insisted it should be, and Microsoft, which had staked its existence on the idea that software was something to be sold rather than shared, became the company that profited most from that transformation. The open letter to hobbyists, controversial as it was at the time, marked the beginning of the modern software industry, in which software is a commercial product worth, collectively, trillions of dollars. Gates saw that future before almost anyone else, and he built his company around it. The early Microsoft in Albuquerque was a young company in every sense. Its employees were almost all in their 20s. They worked extraordinarily long hours, fueled by the conviction that they were at the beginning of something enormous. Gates himself set the tone. He worked obsessively, slept little, and drove himself and everyone around him with a ferocious intensity. He was known, in those early years, for working through the night, for falling asleep at his desk, for memorizing the license plates of his employees so that he could tell who was coming and going and when. He reviewed the company's code personally, line by line, and was famous for his ability to spot inefficiencies and errors that the original programmers had missed. He was, by all accounts, a difficult person to work for, demanding and sometimes harsh, but also brilliant in a way that earned the loyalty of the people who could keep up with him. In 1979, Microsoft moved from Albuquerque to the Seattle area, where Gates and Allen had grown up. The move made sense for various reasons. The company's connection to MITS, which had brought it to Albuquerque in the first place, had ended, and the Seattle area offered a better pool of talent and a more comfortable base for the two founders. Microsoft settled in Bellevue, a suburb east of Seattle, and later in nearby Redmond, where its enormous headquarters campus would eventually be built. The company that had been founded in the shadow of a calculator maker in the New Mexico desert had come home to the Pacific Northwest, where it would grow over the following decades into a giant. Let's pause here for a moment before going on. The story is just getting started and there's no rush to get anywhere. The names so far have been few: Gates, Allen, a company in Albuquerque. None of them need to be held on to. If your attention has already started to drift, that's exactly right. Let your shoulders drop again if they've come up. Let the next breath be a little slower than the last one. The story will keep its same unhurried pace for as long as the night lasts. Chapter 3. The deal that built an empire, the event that turned Microsoft from a small language licensing company into one of the most important businesses in the world, happened in 1980. And it happened because of a decision made by a much larger company that did not, at the time, understand what it was giving away. The larger company was IBM. IBM in 1980 was the largest and most powerful computer company in the world. It made the enormous mainframe computers that ran the data processing of most large corporations and government agencies. It had, for decades, dominated the computer industry so completely that the rest of the industry was sometimes described as IBM and the Seven Dwarfs. But IBM had largely ignored the personal computer market, which it regarded as a hobbyist curiosity, beneath the dignity of a serious computer company. By 1980, IBM had finally noticed that the personal computer market was growing rapidly, and that companies like Apple were making real money in it. IBM decided that it needed to build a personal computer of its own. The way IBM decided to build its personal computer was unusual for IBM. Normally, IBM designed and built every part of its computers itself, from the chips to the software, in a slow and careful process that could take years. But IBM wanted to enter the personal computer market quickly, before the opportunity passed. So it assembled a small team, gave them an unusual amount of freedom, and told them to build a personal computer using parts and software bought from outside companies as quickly as possible. The team would buy the microprocessor from Intel. And it would need an operating system, the basic software that controls a computer and allows other programs to run on it. For that, IBM came to Microsoft. IBM's first approach to Microsoft was actually about programming languages, which was Microsoft's known business. But during the conversations, the question of an operating system came up. IBM had been planning to get its operating system from another company, a firm called Digital Research, which made a popular operating system called CP/M. But the negotiations between IBM and Digital Research fell apart, for reasons that have been described differently by different people involved. IBM came back to Microsoft and asked whether Microsoft could provide an operating system as well. Microsoft did not, at that point, have an operating system. What Gates did next was the decision that made the company. Rather than turning IBM away, Microsoft agreed to provide an operating system and then went and acquired one. There was a small company in Seattle that had written an operating system called 86DOS, sometimes called KeyDOS, which stood for Quick and Dirty Operating System. Microsoft bought the rights to this operating system for a relatively small sum, initially a licensing arrangement, and then an outright purchase for around $50,000. Microsoft adapted it, renamed it MS-DOS, and licensed it to IBM for use on the new IBM personal computer. The story of how Microsoft acquired the operating system has a particular irony to it that is worth dwelling on. The operating system had been written by a programmer named Tim Patterson, who worked at the small Seattle company, called Seattle Computer Products. Patterson had written it relatively quickly as a stopgap, because the operating system that everyone had been expecting, the CP/M system from Digital Research, had been delayed in producing a version for the new Intel processors. Patterson's operating system was, in fact, modeled closely on CP/M. It used many of the same commands and concepts. It was, in essence, a quick imitation of the operating system that IBM had originally wanted. When Microsoft bought it and licensed it to IBM, the result was that the operating system that ended up running on the most important computer in the world was a hastily written imitation of a system whose maker had failed to close the deal. The small decisions and accidents that determined this outcome, the failed negotiation with Digital Research, the existence of Patterson's quick imitation, Microsoft's willingness to step in, added up to one of the most consequential business outcomes of the century. Seattle Computer Products, which had sold the operating system to Microsoft for around $50,000, would later come to feel that it had been badly treated. The company had not known, when it sold the rights, that Microsoft intended to license the operating system to IBM. Had it known the value of what it was selling, it would presumably have demanded far more. There was, years later, a lawsuit which Microsoft settled by paying an additional sum. But the additional sum was trivial compared to the value that the operating system eventually generated. The $50,000 that Microsoft paid for the operating system that became MS-DOS was, in retrospect, one of the great bargains in the history of business. It was the foundation of a fortune that would eventually be measured in hundreds of billions of dollars. The crucial part of the deal, the part that mattered more than anything else, was the licensing arrangement. Gates insisted that Microsoft retain the right to license MS-DOS to other companies, not just IBM. IBM, which thought of itself as being in the hardware business and regarded the operating system as a minor component, agreed. This was, in retrospect, one of the most consequential business decisions of the 20th century. IBM had assumed that its personal computer would succeed or fail based on the IBM name and the IBM hardware. It had not understood that the operating system was the part that mattered, or that allowing Microsoft to license the same operating system to everyone else would eventually make the IBM hardware almost irrelevant. It is worth pausing on why IBM made this mistake, because it reveals something about how even the most powerful companies can fail to see what is coming. IBM, in 1980, made its money from hardware. It built enormous, expensive machines and sold or leased them to large customers. And the software was, in IBM's view, simply something that came along with the hardware to make it useful. The idea that the software might become more valuable than the hardware. That the operating system might be the thing that customers actually cared about. And the hardware might become a commodity that anyone could build, was foreign to IBM's entire way of thinking. IBM was so accustomed to its hardware being the source of its power that it could not imagine a world in which the hardware was the easy part and the software was where the value lay. Gates, who came from the software side, saw exactly the opposite. He understood that the hardware would become a commodity, that many companies would build essentially identical machines, and that the one piece they would all need, the operating system, was where the durable value would be. He was right, and IBM was wrong, and the difference between them, written into a single licensing clause, determined the shape of the industry for the next 20 years. The IBM personal computer was launched in August of 1981. It was an immediate success, because it carried the IBM name. Corporations that had been reluctant to buy personal computers from hobbyist companies were now willing to buy them. The IBM PC became, almost overnight, the standard business computer. And every IBM PC ran MS-DOS, which meant that Microsoft was earning a licensing fee on a rapidly growing number of machines. But the truly enormous consequence came from what happened next. Because the IBM PC had been built from off-the-shelf parts, other companies discovered that they could build machines that were functionally identical to the IBM PC. Machines that could run the same software, without IBM's permission. These machines were called clones. As we walked through on another night, A company called Compaq was the first to build a fully legal clone, and many others followed. Each of these clone makers needed an operating system, and the operating system they needed was MS-DOS, because MS-DOS was what the IBM PC ran, and the whole point of a clone was to be compatible with the IBM PC. So every clone maker came to Microsoft and licensed MS-DOS. Within a few years, there were dozens of companies making IBM-compatible personal computers, and almost all of them ran MS-DOS. IBM had created a standard and then lost control of it, and Microsoft had ended up owning the one piece of the standard that every manufacturer needed. Microsoft was earning a licensing fee on a huge and growing fraction of all the personal computers being sold in the world. The company's revenue grew explosively through the early and middle 1980s. Gates, still in his 20s, was becoming one of the wealthiest people in the technology industry. On the strength of a single shrewd decision about who would own the rights to an operating system that the company had bought almost as an afterthought for $50,000. Chapter 4. Windows MS-DOS, the operating system that had made Microsoft's fortune, was not a particularly pleasant thing to use. It presented the user with a mostly blank screen and a small prompt into which the user had to type commands. To do anything, you had to know the commands and type them correctly and remember the precise names of your files and programs. There were no icons, no windows, no mouse, nothing of what we now think of as a normal computer interface. For people who had learned the commands, MS-DOS was fast and efficient. For everyone else, it was forbidding. The alternative, the graphical interface with windows and icons and a mouse, had been developed at Xerox PARC in the 1970s and had been brought to market by Apple, first in the Lisa and then, more successfully, in the Macintosh in 1984. As we walked through on another night, the Macintosh demonstrated that a personal computer could be friendly, visual, and usable by people who had never learned any commands. The Macintosh was, in this respect, years ahead of the MS-DOS machines. Gates understood, by the early 1980s, that the graphical interface was the future. He understood that, eventually, the command line world of MS-DOS would have to be replaced by something visual. Microsoft had, in fact, been involved in the Macintosh project. It had written some of the first application software for the Macintosh, including early versions of the programs that would become Word and Excel. Gates had seen the Macintosh up close during its development and had come away convinced that the graphical interface was where everything was heading. This put Gates in a peculiar position, which would shape the relationship between Microsoft and Apple for years. Microsoft was, on the one hand, one of the most important software developers for the Macintosh. Apple needed Microsoft's applications to make the Macintosh useful, and Microsoft made good money selling those applications. On the other hand, Microsoft was also building Windows, which was, in its essence, an attempt to bring the same kind of graphical interface that made the Macintosh special to the much larger world of IBM-compatible computers. Apple regarded this as a betrayal. From Apple's point of view, Microsoft was using the knowledge it had gained as a Macintosh developer to build a competing product. From Microsoft's point of view, the graphical interface was the obvious future of computing, and Microsoft had every right to build its own version of it. The two companies were partners and rivals at the same time, in a relationship that grew steadily more tense throughout the 1980s. Microsoft's response was a product called Windows. Windows was, in its early versions, not a complete operating system. It was a graphical layer that ran on top of MS-DOS, providing windows and icons and mouse support, while still relying on MS-DOS underneath for the basic functions. The first version of Windows, released in 1985, was slow, awkward, and not very useful. Almost no one used it. The second version, released in 1987, was somewhat better but still not widely adopted. For years, Windows was regarded, even within the industry, as a weak imitation of the Macintosh interface, bolted clumsily onto an operating system that had not been designed for it. The persistence that Microsoft showed with Windows, through years of failure, is itself worth noting, because it was characteristic of the company. Many companies, having released two unsuccessful versions of a product, would have abandoned it. Microsoft did not. It had an enormous, reliable stream of profit coming from MS-DOS and from its applications, which meant it could afford to keep funding Windows through years of poor sales, waiting for the moment when the hardware would become fast enough and the software would become good enough for the graphical interface to work properly on inexpensive machines. Microsoft was willing to lose, repeatedly, for years, in a market it was convinced would eventually matter. This willingness to absorb years of failure in pursuit of a market it believed in was one of the company's defining traits, and it would appear again and again throughout its history. Microsoft was rarely first and rarely best, but it was almost always still there, several versions later, after its competitors had given up. The relationship between Microsoft and Apple during this period became openly hostile. Apple believed that Windows had copied the look and feel of the Macintosh interface. In 1988, Apple sued Microsoft, claiming that Windows infringed on the visual design of the Macintosh. The lawsuit dragged on for years. It was eventually decided largely in Microsoft's favor, on the grounds that Apple had licensed certain visual elements to Microsoft in an earlier agreement, and that many of the elements Apple was claiming could not be copyrighted in the way Apple wanted. The deeper irony, which was noted at the time, was that both companies had taken the core ideas of the graphical interface from Xerox PARC in the first place. The question of who had really invented the interface that both companies were fighting over did not have a simple answer. The version of Windows that changed everything was Windows 3.0, released in 1990, and its successor, Windows 3.1, released in 1992. These versions were good enough. They were fast enough to be usable. They were stable enough to be relied on. They ran on the inexpensive IBM-compatible computers that, by 1990, vastly outnumbered Macintoshes, and they gave those computers a graphical interface that was, while not as elegant as the Macintosh, good enough for most purposes and available on hardware that cost a fraction of what a Macintosh cost. Windows 3.0 and 3.1 sold in enormous numbers. For the first time, the majority of personal computers in the world had a graphical interface, and that interface was Windows. The product that cemented Microsoft's dominance was Windows 95, released in August of 1995, with a marketing campaign unlike anything the software industry had seen before. Microsoft spent enormous sums on advertising. It licensed a song by the Rolling Stones for the launch. It arranged for the launch to be covered as a news event, with people lining up outside stores at midnight to buy a piece of software, which had never happened before. Windows 95 was a genuine improvement. It integrated the graphical interface more deeply. It was easier to use. It introduced features like the Start menu and the taskbar that would define the Windows experience for decades afterward. It sold tens of millions of copies. By the mid-1990s, Microsoft Windows was running on the overwhelming majority of the personal computers in the world. The command line era was over. The graphical interface had won, and the graphical interface that most people used was Microsoft's. The Windows 95 launch was, in many ways, the moment at which Microsoft reached the peak of its cultural power. The launch was treated by the media as a genuine news event, covered on the evening news and on the front pages of newspapers. Television comedians made jokes about it. People who had never used a computer knew that Windows 95 was being released because it was impossible to avoid the marketing. The song that Microsoft licensed from the Rolling Stones, called Start Me Up, played in the advertisements, chosen partly because of the new Start button that the operating system introduced. The whole event was a demonstration of how central Microsoft had become to the culture, not just to the technology industry. A piece of operating system software had become a mass-market consumer event, the kind of thing that people lined up at midnight to buy. No software company had ever achieved that kind of cultural prominence before, and few have since. What made Windows 95 so important beyond its features was the moment it arrived at. The mid-1990s was the moment when personal computers were moving from being specialized tools, used mostly in offices and by enthusiasts, to being mass-market consumer products that ordinary families bought for their homes. The growth of the Internet, which was just beginning to reach ordinary households around the same time, accelerated this transformation. Millions of people were buying their first computer in the years around 1995, and the overwhelming majority of those computers ran Windows 95. For an entire generation, the experience of using a computer was the experience of using Windows, the Start menu, the taskbar, the particular sounds the operating system made when it started up and shut down, the particular way the windows and icons looked. Microsoft had not just won the operating system market. It had defined, for hundreds of millions of people, what a computer was. A small pause here before we go on. We're a few chapters in now, and the night, presumably, has settled in around you. The story is going to keep going at the same slow pace, whether you're following it closely or have already begun to drift. There's nothing in any of it that you need to keep hold of. Let your body sink a little deeper into wherever it's resting. Let your face soften. Let whatever tension is left in your shoulders ease out of them. The story carries on by itself from here. Chapter 5. The other half of the business while Windows was becoming the dominant operating system, Microsoft was also building a second enormous business. One that was, in some ways, even more profitable than the operating system business. That second business was application software. the programs that people actually use to get their work done. The most important of these programs were the ones that became known collectively as Microsoft Office. Office was a bundle of programs, a word processor called Word, a spreadsheet called Excel, and a presentation program called PowerPoint, along with various others added over the years. Each of these programs had a history of its own, and each had competitors that were, at various points, more popular than the Microsoft version. The word processor market in the 1980s had been dominated by a program called WordPerfect, made by a company of the same name. WordPerfect was, for a time, the standard word processor in offices around the world. It had a devoted user base who knew its commands intimately. The spreadsheet market had been dominated by a program called Lotus 1-2-3, which had been the killer application of the IBM PC in the early 1980s, the program that businesses bought the computer specifically to run, in the way that VisiCalc had been the killer application of the Apple II. Lotus 1-2-3 was, for years, one of the best-selling pieces of software in the world. Microsoft's Word and Excel were, in their early versions, not the leaders in their markets. WordPerfect outsold Word. Lotus 1-2-3 outsold Excel. But Microsoft had a particular advantage that, over the course of the early 1990s, allowed it to overtake both competitors. The advantage was Windows. Microsoft's Word and Excel had been designed from early on to run well on Windows, with the graphical interface that Windows provided. WordPerfect and Lotus, by contrast, had been built for the older command line world of MS-DOS, and they were slow to adapt to Windows. When Windows became dominant in the early 1990s, the applications that ran best on Windows had a significant advantage. And the applications that ran best on Windows were, not coincidentally, the ones made by the same company that made Windows. The failure of WordPerfect and Lotus to adapt to Windows in time is one of the classic cautionary tales of the software industry. Both companies had dominant positions. Both had millions of devoted users. Both had every reason to believe that their dominance would continue. But both underestimated how quickly the world would shift from the command line interface to the graphical interface, and both were too slow to rebuild their products for the new world. WordPerfect, in particular, made a series of decisions that, in retrospect, were disastrous. It delayed its Windows version. It focused on other operating systems that turned out not to matter. It failed to match the quality of Microsoft's Windows applications. By the time WordPerfect had a competitive Windows version, Microsoft Word had already captured the market. The same story, with minor variations, played out with Lotus 1-2-3 and Excel. The lesson that the industry drew from this was that, in software, a dominant position could evaporate with shocking speed if a company failed to adapt to a fundamental shift in the technology. It was a lesson that Microsoft itself would have to relearn painfully in the era of mobile phones, when it found itself in the position that WordPerfect and Lotus had once been in, a dominant company that had failed to adapt to a fundamental shift, watching newer competitors capture the future. There were, over the years, various accusations that Microsoft had used its control of Windows to give its own applications an unfair advantage. Competitors claimed that Microsoft's application teams had access to information about Windows that outside companies did not have. and that Windows was designed in ways that subtly favored Microsoft's own programs. Microsoft denied these claims. Whether or not they were true in the specific ways the competitors allege, the broad outcome was clear. By the late 1990s, Microsoft Office had become the dominant suite of Office software in the world, and WordPerfect and Lotus 1-2-3 had faded into near irrelevance. The combination of Windows and Office gave Microsoft control over two of the most important categories of software, and the profits from those two businesses were enormous. What made Office particularly powerful was a phenomenon that economists sometimes call network effects. Once most offices were using Microsoft Word, it became difficult for any individual office to use anything else, because they needed to be able to exchange documents with everyone else, and everyone else was using Word. A document created in Word could be opened by anyone with Word, and since almost everyone had Word, using anything else meant risking that your documents could not be read by the people you sent them to. The same was true of Excel spreadsheets and PowerPoint presentations. The formats became standards, not because they were necessarily the best, but because everyone used them. And because everyone used them, everyone had to keep using them. This kind of self-reinforcing dominance was extremely difficult for any competitor to break into. It is in large part why Microsoft Office remains, decades later, the standard Office software in much of the world. PowerPoint, the presentation program, became, over the decades, a particularly pervasive part of working life, in ways that went beyond what its creators could have imagined. It became the standard way that ideas were presented in business, in government, in education, in nearly every kind of organization. Meetings everywhere came to revolve around slides projected onto screens, with bullet points and charts and diagrams, all created in PowerPoint. The program became so universal that its particular conventions, the bulleted list, the title slide, the gradual revealing of points one at a time, shaped how an entire civilization communicated its ideas. There were critics who argued that PowerPoint had a corrosive effect on thinking, that it encouraged people to reduce complex ideas to simplistic bullet points, that it substituted the appearance of clarity for actual clarity. Whether or not these criticisms were fair, they were a testament to how deeply the program had embedded itself in the working life of the world. A piece of Microsoft software had become the medium through which a substantial fraction of all professional communication happened. By the second half of the 1990s, Microsoft was one of the most profitable companies in the world. It dominated operating systems through Windows. It dominated Office software through Office. It earned enormous, reliable profits from both. Its stock price had risen so dramatically that thousands of its employees had become millionaires. And Gates himself had become, by the mid-1990s, the richest person in the world, a position he would hold for many years. The small company from Albuquerque had become, in 2 decades, one of the dominant institutions of the global economy. The culture of Microsoft during these peak years was a particular and intense one. It was a company built around brilliant, competitive, hard-working people who were expected to work extraordinarily long hours and to defend their ideas in fierce internal debates. Gates set the tone, as he had from the beginning. He was famous for the intensity of his arguments, for challenging his employees aggressively, for responding to ideas he thought were foolish with a particular dismissive phrase that became legendary within the company. To survive at Microsoft, an employee had to be able to argue, to defend a position under heavy fire, to think on their feet. The culture rewarded a particular kind of aggressive intelligence. It could be exhilarating for the people who thrived in it, and brutal for the people who did not. The company was also, during these years, extraordinarily wealthy, and that wealth created a particular atmosphere. The stock options that Microsoft gave its employees had made enormous numbers of them rich, as the stock price climbed through the 1980s and 1990s. The Seattle area was transformed by Microsoft wealth. Thousands of Microsoft millionaires bought houses, started companies, funded charities, and reshaped the economy of the entire region. The phenomenon was sometimes called, only half-jokingly, the Microsoft economy. The company had created, through its stock, a whole class of newly wealthy people, concentrated in the suburbs east of Seattle, whose fortunes had been made by writing and selling software. It was a new kind of wealth, created in a new kind of industry, and it changed the character of an entire region of the country. What made the company so profitable, underneath all of this, was the particular economics of software. Once a piece of software has been written, the cost of making another copy of it is almost nothing. A company that sells physical products has to manufacture each one, which costs money, so its profits are limited by the cost of manufacturing. A company that sells software has to write the software once, and can then sell millions of copies at almost no additional cost. This means that a dominant software company, one that has captured a large market, can be more profitable than almost any other kind of business, because nearly all of the money from each additional sale is profit. Microsoft, which dominated two enormous software markets, was a money-making machine of a kind that had rarely existed before. The profits flowed in year after year in quantities that were difficult to comprehend, from the simple act of selling additional copies of software that had already been written. Chapter 6. The trial the dominance that Microsoft had achieved by the late 1990s brought with it a particular kind of problem. When a company becomes powerful enough to control the essential infrastructure of an entire industry, governments start to pay attention. And in the late 1990s, the government of the United States began to pay very close attention to Microsoft. The specific trigger was the Internet, and a piece of software called a web browser. In the mid-1990s, as the World Wide Web became popular, the dominant web browser was a program called Netscape Navigator, made by a company called Netscape. The web browser was, at the time, regarded by some as a potential threat to Microsoft's dominance. The theory was that if enough of what people did with computers moved onto the web, then the web browser might become more important than the operating system, and people might stop caring whether they were running Windows. Gates took this threat seriously. In an internal memo, he directed the entire company to focus on the Internet, treating it as the most important challenge Microsoft faced. The memo, titled The Internet Tidal Wave, was written by Gates in 1995, and it is a remarkable document. because it shows a company that had nearly missed an enormous transformation suddenly recognizing it and turning to face it. Microsoft had in the early 1990s been somewhat slow to grasp the importance of the Internet. The company had been focused on its own products and its own networks, and had not initially understood how completely the open, public Internet was going to reshape computing. The Internet tidal wave memo marked the moment when Gates threw the full weight of the company at the Internet. He recognized that the web browser, the program people use to access the Internet, was potentially a kind of competing platform, that if applications moved onto the web, people might access them through any browser, on any operating system, and the importance of Windows might diminish. This was the threat that Netscape represented, and Gates was determined to neutralize it. Microsoft's response was to build its own web browser, called Internet Explorer, and to give it away for free. More than that, Microsoft bundled Internet Explorer with Windows, so that every copy of Windows came with Internet Explorer already installed. Since almost every personal computer ran Windows, this meant that almost every personal computer came with Internet Explorer. Netscape, which had been charging money for its browser, suddenly found itself competing against a free product that came pre-installed on nearly every computer in the world. Netscape's market share collapsed over the following few years. The company was eventually sold, its browser business effectively destroyed. The tactics Microsoft used in the browser war went beyond simply bundling Internet Explorer with Windows. Microsoft also made various arrangements with computer makers and Internet service providers that favored Internet Explorer and disadvantaged Netscape. It used its control over Windows as leverage, in ways that competitors found deeply unfair. Computer makers who wanted to install Windows on their machines, which was nearly all of them, found that Microsoft's licensing terms made it difficult or disadvantageous to also feature Netscape. The full weight of Microsoft's dominance in operating systems was brought to bear on the browser market, and Netscape, despite having created the product that defined the early web, could not withstand it. This was the conduct that the government would later argue was illegal. Not the building of a competing browser, which was perfectly legitimate, but the use of monopoly power in one market to win in another. The United States Department of Justice, along with a group of state attorneys general, came to believe that Microsoft had used its monopoly over operating systems illegally to crush competition in the browser market. They argued that bundling Internet Explorer with Windows and various other tactics Microsoft had used against Netscape and other competitors amounted to an illegal abuse of monopoly power. In 1998, the government filed a major antitrust lawsuit against Microsoft. It was the largest antitrust case the United States had brought against a company since the breakup of the telephone monopoly years earlier. The trial took place in 1998 and 1999 in a federal court in Washington. It was a major news event. Gates himself was questioned in a videotaped deposition that was played in court, and his performance was widely regarded as a disaster. He was evasive, combative, and argumentative over the precise meaning of ordinary words. The image of the world's richest man quibbling over what the word compete meant did considerable damage to Microsoft's public reputation. various Microsoft executives testified. Various competitors testified about how Microsoft had treated them. The picture that emerged over the course of the trial was of a company that had used its dominance aggressively, sometimes brutally, against anyone who threatened it. The deposition, in particular, became famous. Gates, who was used to being the most powerful person in any room, and who was accustomed to arguing aggressively and winning, found himself being questioned by government lawyers who were carefully laying traps in his own words. His response was to become combative and pedantic, disputing the meaning of common words, claiming not to remember things that seemed difficult to forget, treating the questions with a barely concealed contempt. To Gates, the questions may have seemed foolish, the legal process an absurd intrusion on a company that had simply competed and won. But to the public watching and to the judge, the performance came across as arrogant and evasive. It reinforced the image of Microsoft that its enemies had been promoting for years, a company that believed itself above the rules, run by a man who thought he was smarter than everyone else and was not afraid to show it. The deposition did more damage to Microsoft's reputation than any of the specific charges in the case. The judge in the case, Thomas Penfield Jackson, ruled against Microsoft. He found that Microsoft was a monopoly and had illegally maintained its monopoly through anti-competitive conduct. In 2000, he ordered that Microsoft be broken up into two separate companies, one for the operating system, one for the applications. It was the kind of remedy that had been used against monopolies before, most famously against the telephone company. For a period, it appeared that Microsoft might actually be split in two. But it did not happen. Microsoft appealed. The appeals court, while it upheld the finding that Microsoft was an illegally maintained monopoly, overturned the breakup order, partly on procedural grounds and partly because the judge had spoken to the press about the case in ways that suggested bias. The case was sent back to a different judge. By this point, a new presidential administration had taken office with a different attitude toward antitrust enforcement. The government and Microsoft negotiated a settlement, finalized in 2001 and 2002. Under the settlement, Microsoft was not broken up. It agreed to various restrictions on its conduct. It had to share certain technical information with competitors and refrain from certain kinds of retaliation against computer makers. But it remained intact and it remained dominant. The antitrust case is sometimes described as a defeat for Microsoft and sometimes as a victory. It was, in some ways, both. Microsoft avoided being broken up, which was the outcome it most feared. But the case consumed years of the company's attention and energy, damaged its reputation, and arguably distracted it during a crucial period. Some observers have argued that the antitrust case, by making Microsoft more cautious and more inward-looking, allowed competitors like Google to emerge and flourish in markets that Microsoft might otherwise have dominated. Whether or not that is true, the years around the antitrust case marked a kind of turning point. The era of Microsoft's unchallenged dominance was, in some sense, beginning to come to an end, even as the company remained enormously powerful. There is an argument made by various people who have studied the case that the antitrust trial mattered less for the specific remedies it produced. which were, in the end, relatively mild than for the psychological effect it had on the company. Before the trial, Microsoft had been fearless, aggressive, willing to use every advantage it had against any competitor. After the trial, the company was more cautious. It had been publicly humiliated. It had come close to being broken up. Its leaders had learned that there were limits to how aggressively a dominant company could behave without bringing the government down on its head. This new caution may have served the company well in some respects by keeping it out of further legal trouble. But it may also have contributed to the timidity that characterized the lost years when Microsoft repeatedly failed to move boldly into new markets. A company that had learned to fear the consequences of its own dominance was perhaps less willing to do the aggressive things that winning new markets sometimes required. The antitrust case in this reading did not break Microsoft up, but it may have broken something in the company's spirit, at least for a time. There is also a broader lesson in the Microsoft antitrust case about what happens when a company becomes essential infrastructure. Microsoft, by the late 1990s, was not just a successful company. It controlled something that the entire economy had come to depend on: the operating system that ran almost all the world's personal computers. When a private company gains control over something that everyone depends on, the question of how that control should be limited becomes a public question, a matter for governments and courts rather than just for markets. The Microsoft case was one of the first great examples in the technology industry of this kind of confrontation between a dominant technology company and the government. It would not be the last. In the decades that followed, similar questions would be raised about other technology companies that came to control essential infrastructure, about Google and search, about Amazon and online commerce, about Apple and Google and their app stores. The Microsoft case set the template for these later confrontations, establishing both that dominant technology companies could be challenged and that the challenges were difficult, slow, and uncertain in their outcomes. A quiet pause. Here, we're past the middle of the story now and into the parts that are more recent. The pace from here stays gentle. There's nothing in the chapters ahead that asks anything of you, and nothing that needs to be remembered. If you've drifted off already, the story has carried on without you, exactly as it was meant to. If you're still here, let yourself settle a little further down into the quiet. The voice keeps going, the same as before, into whatever the rest of the night holds. Chapter 7. The lost years, the decade or so after the antitrust case, is sometimes described by people who study Microsoft as the company's lost years. Microsoft remained, throughout this period, enormously profitable. Windows and Office continued to generate vast amounts of money. But the company seemed to lose its ability to win in new markets. Again and again, through the 2000s and into the early 2010s, Microsoft entered an important new market, and again, it failed to dominate that market the way it had once dominated operating systems and office software. The clearest example was search. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, a new company called Google built a search engine that became, very quickly, the way most people found things on the internet. Search turned out to be one of the most valuable businesses in the history of technology because it could be paired with advertising in a way that generated enormous profits. Microsoft recognized the importance of search and tried repeatedly to compete. It built its own search engines under various names, eventually settling on the name Bing. It spent enormous sums, but it never came close to displacing Google. Search remained, year after year, a business that Microsoft lost. The same pattern repeated in other markets. When smartphones became important, in the late 2000s, Microsoft tried to build a mobile operating system to compete with Apple's iPhone and Google's Android. As we walked through on another night, the iPhone had redefined what a phone could be, and the mobile operating system became one of the most important categories in all of technology. Microsoft had in fact been making software for handheld devices since before the iPhone existed. But its mobile efforts, rebranded several times, never gained meaningful traction against Apple and Google. Microsoft eventually bought the phone business of Nokia, the Finnish company that had once dominated mobile phones, in an attempt to build its own phone hardware. The acquisition was a costly failure. Within a few years, Microsoft had written off almost the entire value of the purchase and largely abandoned the phone business. The company that controlled the operating system on almost every personal computer in the world had been completely shut out of the operating system on phones, which were rapidly becoming the most important computers most people owned. The failure in mobile was, in retrospect, the most consequential of all Microsoft's missed opportunities. The smartphone became, over the following years, the most important computing device in the world, the computer that more people used, more of the time, than any other. The companies that controlled the smartphone operating systems, Apple and Google, gained enormous power as a result. They controlled the platforms through which billions of people accessed the internet, used applications, and conducted much of their digital lives. This was exactly the kind of position that Microsoft had held in the era of the personal computer with Windows. And Microsoft, which understood better than any company in the world the value of controlling an operating system platform, had failed to win the most important new platform of its time. It was a particularly bitter failure, because it was a failure in precisely the kind of competition that Microsoft had once been the master of. The company that had taught the world how valuable it was to own the operating system had been shut out of the operating system that came to matter most. The leader of Microsoft through most of this period was Steve Ballmer, who had become chief executive in 2000, when Gates stepped back from day-to-day management to focus on technical strategy and, increasingly, on philanthropy. Ballmer was a forceful, energetic, intensely loud personality, famous for his enthusiastic and sometimes alarming appearances at company events. He was, by all accounts, a brilliant salesman and a formidable businessman. Under his leadership, Microsoft's revenue and profits actually grew substantially. The company made more money during the Ballmer years than it had during the Gates years. But Ballmer's Microsoft was also the Microsoft that missed search, missed mobile, missed several other important transitions. The company was making enormous amounts of money from its existing businesses while failing to win the new ones. To outside observers, it looked like a company that had become complacent, that was living off its past dominance rather than building its future. Ballmer himself, years later, acknowledged that the failure in mobile was the thing he most regretted from his time as chief executive. He had been so focused on protecting and growing the enormously profitable Windows business that he had not moved aggressively enough into the new world of mobile devices, and by the time the company tried to catch up, it was too late. There were also genuine successes during this period, which are sometimes forgotten because of the prominence of the failures. The Xbox, Microsoft's video game console, launched in 2001, became a major business and one of the leaders in the game industry, a position it has held ever since. Microsoft's business software for large corporations, the various server products and enterprise tools that ran the back-end systems of large organizations, grew into an enormous and highly profitable business, even though it was invisible to ordinary consumers. Windows and Office, though no longer growing rapidly, remained extraordinarily profitable. Microsoft, even in its lost years, was never in any danger of failing. It was simply failing to grow into the new and exciting markets while remaining hugely successful in its old ones. The Windows operating system itself went through a difficult period during these years, which contributed to the sense that the company had lost its way. After the success of Windows 95 and its successors, Microsoft released a version called Windows XP in 2001, which was widely regarded as excellent, stable, reliable, and pleasant to use. Windows XP became enormously popular and remained in widespread use for many years. But its successor, called Windows Vista, released in 2007, was a notable failure. Vista was slow, demanding of hardware, plagued with compatibility problems, and widely disliked. Many users and businesses refused to upgrade to it, choosing to stay with the older Windows XP instead. The failure of Vista was embarrassing for a company whose core product was its operating system, and it took the following version, Windows 7, released in 2009, to repair the damage. The Vista episode reinforced the general impression of Microsoft during these years, as a company that had become bloated and slow, struggling even with the products that had once been its greatest strength. The deeper problem, which observers identified at the time and which Microsoft's later leadership would acknowledge, was a kind of internal dysfunction. Microsoft had grown into an enormous organization with many divisions, each protecting its own interests. The different parts of the company often competed with one another rather than cooperating. New ideas that threatened the existing businesses of Windows and Office were frequently smothered, because the people who ran those enormously profitable businesses had no interest in supporting anything that might undermine them. The company had become, in the language sometimes used to describe such organizations, a set of warring fiefdoms, each defending its own territory, with the overall direction of the company suffering as a result. The culture of fierce internal competition that had once driven Microsoft's success had curdled, in its years of dominance, into a culture of internal politics that prevented the company from moving boldly into new markets. This was the situation that the company's next leader would have to confront. By the early 2010s, the general view of Microsoft in the technology industry and in the financial markets was that it had become a kind of dinosaur. It was large, profitable, and slow. It dominated the personal computer software market at exactly the moment when the personal computer was becoming less important, displaced by smartphones and tablets and the various services delivered over the Internet. The company's stock price, which had risen so dramatically in the 1980s and 1990s, had been essentially flat for more than a decade. Investors had largely given up on the idea that Microsoft would ever again be a growth company. It seemed, to many people, like a company whose best days were behind it. Chapter 8. The quiet turnaround in 2014, Steve Ballmer retired, and Microsoft chose a new chief executive named Satya Nadella. Nadella had been at Microsoft for more than 2 decades, working mostly in the parts of the company that built software and services for large businesses, and most recently running the division responsible for Microsoft's cloud computing efforts. He was, in personality, almost the opposite of Ballmer. Where Ballmer was loud, Nadella was calm. Where Ballmer was combative, Nadella was conciliatory. He spoke softly in measured sentences, often about topics like empathy and learning that were not commonly associated with the aggressive Microsoft of earlier decades. Many observers, when he was appointed, did not expect much to change. Microsoft had a long history by this point of being a slow and inward-looking company. A new chief executive, however thoughtful, seemed unlikely to alter that. Nadella had grown up in Hyderabad, in India, the son of a civil servant. He had come to the United States for graduate study and had joined Microsoft in the early 1990s, in his mid-20s. He had spent his entire career at the company, working his way up through various technical and business roles, mostly in the less glamorous parts of the company, the parts that built software and services for businesses rather than the consumer-facing products that got all the attention. He was not a founder. He was not a famous public figure. He was, when he became chief executive, almost unknown outside the company. This turned out to be, in some ways, an advantage. He carried none of the baggage of the old Microsoft. He had not been one of the architects of the company's aggressive culture or its monopolistic battles. He was free to remake the company in a way that someone more identified with its past might not have been. One of the first things Nadella did as chief executive was to try to change the culture of the company. He spoke repeatedly about the difference between what he called a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. The difference between a culture in which people felt they had to prove they were the smartest person in the room and a culture in which people felt free to learn, to make mistakes, to collaborate. The old Microsoft had been, famously, a fixed mindset company, full of brilliant people competing to prove their brilliance, often at the expense of cooperation. Nadella wanted to change this. He wanted Microsoft to become a company that learned, that cooperated internally, that was curious about the world rather than contemptuous of it. This kind of cultural change is difficult to achieve in any organization, and especially difficult in one as large and as set in its ways as Microsoft had become. But over the following years, by most accounts, Nadella largely succeeded. The company became, under his leadership, a noticeably different place to work, more collaborative and less politically vicious than it had been. But over the following years, Nadella oversaw one of the more remarkable corporate transformations in modern business history. The The transformation was based, more than anything, on a single strategic bet that the future of computing was in the cloud. Cloud computing is, at its core, a simple idea. Instead of running software on your own computer, you run it on enormous computers owned by someone else, located in vast data centers somewhere far away, and you access it over the internet. For an individual person, the cloud is the difference between storing your photos on your own hard drive and storing them on a service that keeps them on its own computers, accessible from anywhere. For a large business, the cloud is far more significant. Instead of buying and maintaining its own computers, a business can rent computing power from a cloud provider, paying only for what it uses and scaling up or down as needed. This turned out to be enormously valuable to businesses, and the business of providing cloud computing turned out to be one of the most important new markets in all of technology. The reason the cloud mattered so much to businesses is worth understanding, because it explains why Microsoft's bet on it was so consequential. In the old way of doing things, a business that needed computing power had to buy its own computers, install them in its own buildings, hire staff to maintain them, and plan carefully for how much capacity it would need. If it bought too little, its systems would be overwhelmed when demand spiked. If it bought too much, it would have wasted money on computers that sat idle. The cloud eliminated this problem. A business could simply rent exactly as much computing power as it needed at any given moment, scaling up instantly when demand rose and scaling down when it fell, paying only for what it actually used. This was enormously more efficient than the old way, and it freed businesses from having to think about computing infrastructure at all. They could focus on their actual business and let the cloud provider worry about the computers. For Microsoft, which had spent decades selling software to businesses, the shift to the cloud was both a threat and an opportunity. A threat because it could undermine the old business of selling software that ran on the customer's own computers, and an opportunity because Microsoft, with its deep relationships with businesses around the world, was well positioned to become one of the great providers of cloud computing. Nadella bet that it was more opportunity than threat, and he was right. The leader in cloud computing when Nadella took over was not Microsoft. It was Amazon, whose Amazon Web Services division had pioneered the business and dominated it. Microsoft had a cloud platform called Azure, but it was well behind Amazon. Nadella, who had run the Azure business before becoming chief executive, bet the company's future on catching up. He reorganized Microsoft around the cloud. He shifted the company's enormous resources toward building out Azure's data centers and capabilities. He changed how Microsoft sold its software, moving from the old model of selling a copy of a program once to a new model of charging a subscription for continuous access to software delivered over the Internet. Office, the cash cow of the old Microsoft, was transformed from a product you bought into a service you subscribed to, called Office 365 and later Microsoft 365. Nadella also changed Microsoft's attitude toward the rest of the technology industry. The old Microsoft had treated every other company as an enemy to be destroyed. Nadella's Microsoft was more willing to cooperate. It made its software available on competitors' platforms. Microsoft Office appeared on Apple's iPhones and iPads, and on Google's Android phones, something the old Microsoft would have resisted. It embraced the open-source software movement, which the old Microsoft under Ballmer had once described as a kind of cancer. Microsoft bought GitHub, the platform that hosted much of the world's open-source software, and, to the surprise of many, ran it well and left it largely alone. The company that had once been the most feared and resented in the industry became, over the course of a decade, a company that many developers and businesses were willing to work with. The acquisitions that Microsoft made under Nadella told the story of the new strategy. The company bought LinkedIn, the professional networking service, for a very large sum, gaining access to an enormous network of business professionals and the data about them. It bought GitHub, embedding itself at the center of the world's software development community. It made various other acquisitions in gaming, eventually including the enormous purchase of Activision Blizzard, one of the largest video game publishers in the world, which made Microsoft a giant in the game industry. These acquisitions were strategic in a way that the company's earlier flailing in search and mobile had not been. Each of them strengthened a position that Microsoft was actually well suited to hold, rather than chasing a market where it was hopelessly behind. Nadella had a clearer sense than his predecessor of what Microsoft was actually good at, and where it could actually win, and he directed the company's enormous resources toward those areas rather than toward the markets where it had repeatedly failed. The results were extraordinary. Azure grew rapidly, becoming the second largest cloud platform in the world, behind only Amazon, and growing faster than Amazon for years. The subscription model for Office produced a steady, growing stream of revenue that was even more valuable than the old model of selling individual copies. Microsoft's overall revenue and profits grew dramatically, and the stock price, which had been flat for more than a decade, began to rise and then rose dramatically. By the late 2010s, Microsoft had become, once again, one of the most valuable companies in the world, competing with Apple for the title of the single most valuable company on Earth. The dinosaur, which everyone had written off, had quietly become a growth company again. It was one of the more unexpected second acts in the history of business. It is worth dwelling on how unusual this kind of corporate revival is, because it almost never happens. The history of business is full of companies that dominated their industries and then declined, slowly and irreversibly, as the world changed around them. Most companies, once they have lost their edge, never recover it. They continue, sometimes for decades, as shrinking shadows of what they were, living off their existing customers while gradually fading from importance. The number of companies that have fallen from dominance into a decade of stagnation and then climbed back to the very top of the global economy is very small. Microsoft is one of the few. The transformation that Nadella oversaw, taking a company that had been written off as a slow-moving relic and turning it, within a decade, back into one of the most valuable and dynamic companies in the world, is studied now in business schools as one of the great examples of corporate reinvention. Whether it could have happened with a different leader, or whether it depended on the particular qualities that Nadella brought, is impossible to know. But it happened, and it changed the trajectory of one of the most important companies in the world. We're coming into the last part of the story now. One more chapter after this one, and then a closing, and then quiet. If you've drifted off somewhere back in the earlier chapters, you've missed nothing that matters, and the story has gone on telling itself in the dark just the same. If you're still here, let yourself ease down a little further. The remaining parts are gentle ones. There's no new effort being asked of you, only the same slow voice carrying on toward the end of the night. Chapter 9. The artificial intelligence bet the most recent chapter of Microsoft's story, and in some ways the most surprising, has to do with artificial intelligence, and with a partnership that Microsoft formed with a small research organization that, at the time, almost no one outside the field had heard of. The research organization was called OpenAI. It had been founded in the middle of the 2010s in San Francisco by a group of people who believed that artificial intelligence was going to become one of the most important technologies in human history, and who wanted to influence how it was developed. As we walked through on another night, OpenAI spent its early years doing research that, for a long time, did not produce any obvious commercial product. It was, in its early form, a research lab, funded by donations and investments, working on problems whose practical value was not yet clear. Microsoft, under Nadella, began investing in OpenAI in 2019. The initial investment was around $1 billion, which was a substantial sum but not, by Microsoft's standards, an enormous one. The investment was unusual in its structure. Much of it came not as cash but as credits for Microsoft's Azure cloud computing service, which OpenAI needed in enormous quantities to train its artificial intelligence systems. The arrangement was, in a sense, ideal for both parties. OpenAI got access to the vast computing resources it needed, which only a handful of companies in the world could provide. Microsoft got a close relationship with one of the leading artificial intelligence research organizations, and a reason for OpenAI to build its systems on Microsoft's cloud rather than a competitor's. For several years, the partnership produced interesting research, but nothing that captured wide public attention. Then, in late 2022, OpenAI released a system called ChatGPT, which allowed ordinary people to have written conversations with an artificial intelligence system. ChatGPT became, almost immediately, one of the fastest-growing consumer products in history. It reached enormous numbers of users within weeks. It became, for a period, the most discussed technology in the world, and Microsoft, through its partnership with OpenAI, was positioned at the very center of it. The speed with which ChatGPT captured the world's attention was unlike anything the technology industry had seen. Most successful products grow over months and years. ChatGPT grew over days. Within a week of its release, it had 1 million users. Within 2 months, it had 100 million. People used it to write essays, to answer questions, to draft emails, to write computer code, to have conversations about every imaginable topic. It became, almost overnight, a cultural phenomenon, discussed everywhere, used by enormous numbers of people, treated as a glimpse of a new era in computing. And because Microsoft had invested in OpenAI years earlier, when almost no one was paying attention, Microsoft suddenly found itself holding one of the most valuable positions in the entire technology industry, at the center of what appeared to be the most important technological shift in a generation. Microsoft moved quickly to take advantage of its position. It increased its investment in OpenAI dramatically, eventually committing many billions of dollars. It integrated OpenAI's technology into its own products, into its Bing search engine, into its Office applications, into its programming tools, and into a range of new products that it grouped under the name Copilot. The idea was that artificial intelligence assistants would become a feature of all of Microsoft's software, helping people write documents, analyze spreadsheets, write computer code, and search for information. For a period, Microsoft appeared to have, through its OpenAI partnership, a significant lead in what was suddenly the most important new technology in the industry. There was a particular irony in Microsoft using artificial intelligence to revive Bing, its search engine. Bing had been, for years, one of the clearest symbols of Microsoft's failures during the lost years. The product that had spent enormous sums trying and failing to compete with Google. When ChatGPT appeared, Microsoft saw an opportunity to use the new technology to finally challenge Google in search. It built artificial intelligence features into Bing and promoted them aggressively, hoping that the new technology would let it capture some of the search market that had eluded it for so long. Whether this would ultimately work was unclear. Google was an enormous and capable competitor, with its own artificial intelligence research, and it was not going to surrender the search market easily. But the attempt itself showed how completely the situation had changed. The company that had been written off as a slow-moving relic was now moving aggressively, using a new technology, to challenge a competitor in a market it had lost years earlier. The energy that had drained out of Microsoft during the lost years had returned. The relationship between Microsoft and OpenAI grew complicated over time, in the way that such relationships often do. The two organizations were partners, but they were also increasingly potential competitors, since both were building artificial intelligence products and both wanted to capture the value of the technology. OpenAI restructured itself several times, moving from its original nonprofit form toward a structure that could raise the enormous sums of money that building artificial intelligence systems required. The financial arrangements between the two companies were renegotiated more than once. By the middle of the 2020s, Microsoft held a large ownership stake in the commercial part of OpenAI, worth, on paper, an enormous amount of money, while the precise terms of the partnership continued to shift. Microsoft also began, around the same time, to build its own artificial intelligence systems, partly to reduce its dependence on OpenAI in case the partnership did not last. There was a particularly dramatic moment in the relationship, in late 2023, when the board of OpenAI suddenly fired its chief executive, Sam Altman, in a decision that stunned the technology industry. For a few days, it appeared that OpenAI might fall apart entirely. Microsoft, which had invested billions of dollars in the organization, found its enormous bet suddenly in jeopardy. Nadella moved quickly. He offered to hire Altman and any OpenAI employees who wanted to come, to build an artificial intelligence division inside Microsoft. The threat of a mass exodus, combined with pressure from OpenAI's own employees, most of whom threatened to quit, led to Altman being reinstated within days, and the board that had fired him being replaced. The episode demonstrated both the value and the fragility of Microsoft's position. It had bet enormously on an organization it did not fully control, and when that organization nearly destroyed itself, Microsoft had to scramble to protect its investment. The partnership survived, but the episode was a reminder of how much Microsoft had staked on a relationship with a partner whose interests did not always align with its own. What this period demonstrated, more than anything, was that the transformation Nadella had begun was real. The old Microsoft, the Microsoft of the lost years, would almost certainly have missed the artificial intelligence wave the way it had missed search and mobile. The new Microsoft, the one that had remade itself around the cloud and learned to partner rather than only to compete, was positioned at the center of the most important technological shift of its time. Whether the artificial intelligence bet would ultimately pay off in the way that the cloud bet had was not yet clear. The technology was new, the costs were enormous, and the competition was fierce. But Microsoft had, at least, put itself in a position to win, which was something that the company of a decade earlier had seemed incapable of doing. Chapter 10. What it has become the Microsoft of the present day is, in some ways, a stranger and more interesting company than it was at the height of its dominance in the 1990s. In the 1990s, Microsoft was a company that almost everyone interacted with, through Windows and Office, and that many people resented, because of its dominance and its aggressive business practices. It was the company that the technology world loved to hate. Its products were everywhere and were widely regarded as adequate rather than excellent. The software you used because you had to, not because you wanted to. The Microsoft of the present day is, in a curious way, both more and less visible than it used to be. It is less visible because much of what it now does happens in places that ordinary people never see. The enormous data centers that run Azure, the cloud platform that has become one of Microsoft's most important businesses, are invisible to the people whose photos and documents and business systems they hold. The server software that runs the back-end systems of large corporations is invisible to everyone except the technical staff who manage it. A great deal of Microsoft's business now consists of providing the invisible infrastructure on which other things run. It has become, in some sense, one of the great infrastructure companies of the digital age, in the way that a power company or a railroad is infrastructure, essential, enormous, and largely unnoticed. The data centers themselves are worth pausing on, because they represent something about the scale of what Microsoft has become. These are enormous buildings, often in remote locations, filled with row upon row of computers, consuming vast amounts of electricity, requiring elaborate cooling systems to keep from overheating. There are dozens of them scattered around the world in places chosen for their cheap electricity, their cool climates, their proximity to the networks that carry data. Most people will never see one, will never know where the nearest one is, will never think about them at all. But these buildings hold an increasing fraction of the digital life of the world. The documents, the photographs, the business records, the communications, the artificial intelligence systems. When you use a service that runs in the cloud, your data is, quite literally in one of these buildings, being processed by computers that Microsoft or one of its competitors owns and operates. The infrastructure of the digital world has become physical again, concentrated in these enormous, invisible buildings owned by a small number of enormous, increasingly invisible companies. Microsoft is one of them. And yet it is also, still, present in the most ordinary corners of daily life. Most office workers, around the world, still spend their days in Microsoft Word and Microsoft Excel and Microsoft Outlook, the way office workers have for 30 years. Most personal computers, the ones that are not made by Apple, still run Windows. The basic tools of office work in much of the world are still Microsoft's tools, used so habitually that the people using them rarely think about who made them. There is something fitting about this. Microsoft was never, even at its height, a company that inspired the kind of passion that Apple inspired. It was a company that made the tools that people use to get their work done reliably, without much excitement, day after day. That is, more or less, what it remains. What is striking about the Microsoft story, looked at as a whole, is how different it is from the stories of the companies it is usually compared to. The Apple story is a story of design, of charisma, of a single visionary founder and the products he obsessed over. The Microsoft story is a story of business, of shrewd deals, of strategic positioning, of a relentless focus on the parts of the industry where the money was, rather than the parts where the glory was. Gates was never the kind of figure that Jobs was. He was not a designer. He did not give legendary product presentations. He was, instead, an extraordinarily effective businessman, who understood, more clearly than almost anyone, where the value in the computer industry actually lay, and who positioned his company, again and again, to capture that value. The decision that built the company, retaining the right to license MS-DOS to anyone, not just M, was not a design decision or a technical decision. It was a business decision made by a young man who understood something about the structure of the industry that the much larger and more experienced M did not understand. That pattern of winning through business strategy rather than through product excellence repeated throughout Microsoft's history. The company did not usually make the best product in a category. It made the product that, through one strategic advantage or another, ended up being the one that everyone used. Windows was not better than the Macintosh. Office was not initially better than WordPerfect and Lotus. But they won, because of bundling and pricing and network effects and the various other forms of business advantage that Microsoft understood how to use. This is, in a sense, the deepest lesson of the Microsoft story, and it is a lesson that many people find slightly uncomfortable. We like to believe that the best product wins, that quality, in the end, is what determines success. The Microsoft story suggests that this is not always true, or at least not in the simple way we might wish. In the markets that Microsoft dominated, the winner was usually not the best product, but the best positioned product. The one that, through some combination of business strategy, timing, and the structure of the market, ended up being the one that everyone used, after which the network effects took over and made its dominant self-reinforcing. The Macintosh was, by most accounts, a better designed computer than the Windows machines it competed against. It lost anyway, because Microsoft had positioned Windows to run on cheaper hardware, and because once most people were using Windows, most software was written for Windows. And once most software was written for Windows, most people had to use Windows. Quality mattered, but position mattered more. This is not a comfortable truth, but it is, on the evidence of the Microsoft story, a true one. The two founders both moved on from the company eventually in different ways. Paul Allen had left Microsoft early, in 1983, after being diagnosed with cancer and after a falling out with Gates over the division of ownership in the company. He recovered from the cancer and spent the following decades as an investor, a philanthropist, and the owner of various sports teams and other ventures. He died in 2018 of a recurrence of cancer, having spent much of his fortune on philanthropy and on his various wide-ranging interests. Gates stepped back from running Microsoft in 2000, and stepped back from full-time work at the company in 2008 to focus on the foundation he had created with his wife, which became one of the largest charitable organizations in the world, focused on global health and poverty. He remained for many years one of the wealthiest people in the world, and devoted the later part of his life primarily to giving that wealth away. The transformation of Gates's public image over the decades is itself a remarkable story. In the 1990s, he was, to many people, the villain of the technology industry, the ruthless monopolist, the man who crushed competitors, the face of a company that seemed to want to control everything. By the 2010s and 2020s, he had become something close to the opposite, an elder statesman of global philanthropy, devoting his fortune and his energy to fighting disease and poverty in the poorest parts of the world. The foundation he created with his wife became one of the most significant forces in global health, funding the development and distribution of vaccines, working to eradicate diseases that had afflicted humanity for centuries, spending more on certain global health problems than many national governments. The aggressive young man who had written the angry letter to hobbyists, who had crushed Netscape, who had quibbled over the meaning of the word compete in his deposition, had become, in his later life, a figure devoted to using his enormous wealth for the benefit of people he would never meet. Whether this redemption was complete, or how it should be weighed against the aggressive business practices of his earlier years, is a matter on which people disagree. But the arc of his life, from ruthless competitor to global philanthropist, is one of the more striking transformations in the history of American business. What the company will become in the coming years is, of course, not knowable. The artificial intelligence bet may transform it again, or may turn out to be an expensive disappointment. The cloud business may continue to grow, or may be overtaken by competitors. The old businesses of Windows and Office may continue their long, slow, immensely profitable decline, or may be disrupted by something not yet visible. Microsoft has by now survived for half a century, through several complete transformations of the technology industry, and has remained throughout one of its most important companies. That kind of durability is rare. Whether it will continue is, as with all such questions, something that only time will answer. Closing, if you have stayed with this story from the beginning, and if you haven't, that's exactly as it was meant to be. You may have noticed something about Microsoft that is easy to miss when the company is compared to its flashier competitors. The thing about Microsoft is that it is, in some sense, the company that won by being underneath everything. It did not win by making the most beautiful products, or by inspiring the most devotion, or by being the company that people pointed to as the future. It won by making the software that everything else ran on, and by positioning itself, through one shrewd decision after another, at the layer of the industry where the value quietly accumulated. The operating system underneath the applications, the office software underneath the work, the cloud underneath the services, the artificial intelligence underneath the next generation of products. Again and again, Microsoft found the layer that everything else depended on, and made itself the owner of that layer. This is in some ways a less romantic story than the stories of the companies that win through brilliant products and visionary design. There is no single moment in the Microsoft story as dramatic as the introduction of the Macintosh or the iPhone. There is instead a long series of careful business decisions, made by people who understood the structure of their industry extraordinarily well, and who were willing to be unglamorous, and patient and relentless in pursuit of the positions that mattered. The result of all those decisions is a company whose products are used, in some form, by most of the people who use computers at all, and most of whom never think about the company at all. There is something worth noticing in this, which is that the things that end up being most important in the world are often not the things that are most visible. The phone in your hand is visible. You think about it, you choose it, you have feelings about it. The operating system that runs the servers that deliver the services to the phone is not visible. You never think about it. You have no feelings about it. But it is, in its own way, just as essential, and the company that makes it is just as consequential, even though it lives in the part of the picture that the eye slides past. Microsoft has spent 50 years living in that part of the picture, and it has become, by doing so, one of the most valuable companies that has ever existed. This is true of a great deal of the modern world, not just of Microsoft. The things that hold up our lives are mostly invisible to us. The electrical grid that powers everything, the water systems that bring water to our homes, the networks of pipes and cables and servers and roads and supply chains that make modern life possible. We think about the visible things, the products we buy, the devices we hold, the brands we have feelings about. We rarely think about the infrastructure underneath, which is doing the actual work of holding everything up. And yet, the infrastructure is, in a sense, more important than the visible things, because everything visible depends on it. Microsoft, by positioning itself in the infrastructure layer of the digital world, made itself into one of those invisible but essential things. It is not a company that most people have strong feelings about. It is a company that most people depend on, constantly, without thinking about it at all. There is a kind of quiet power in that position, a power that does not announce itself, that does not seek attention, that simply sits underneath everything, indispensable and unnoticed. You don't need to remember any of this. The infrastructure will keep running whether you think about it or not. That is, in a sense, the whole point of infrastructure, that it works quietly, underneath everything, without requiring your attention. The documents will keep being written in Word. The spreadsheets will keep being calculated in Excel. The servers will keep running in the data centers. The whole vast invisible machinery will keep operating tonight and tomorrow and for years to come, mostly unnoticed by the people whose lives depend on it. The room you are in is quiet now. The lights, if you left them on, can stay on or turn off. The blanket, if you pulled it up, is still where you left it. Somewhere, in a data center you will never see, in a building in a place you will never go, computers running software descended from the work of two young men in Albuquerque half a century ago, are quietly doing the work that holds up a piece of the modern world. The work goes on whether or not anyone is watching. It will go on tonight, while you sleep. It will go on in the morning, when you wake. The story is, in some sense, still being written, in the quiet, underneath everything, where the most important things so often are. Sleep well.